This is Chapter 5, Section 5, Toward Independence, 1775 through 1776. So just backing up to review from Section 4, we had talked about the outbreak of actual fighting between the colonists and the British. It started in Lexington, and the colonists were outnumbered and had to retreat back to Concord. And by that time they were able to get enough men together and push the British back over the Old North Bridge, which you can see in the picture, and then the British had to retreat back to Boston. And so this was really celebrated by the colonists, because here they were, not even really a military yet, they were just a militia, and they were just farmers, and they were able to push the British military back. And so to commemorate this, years later, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a poem called Concord Hymn. And it starts by saying, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood," speaking of the Old North Bridge, "their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood," the embattled farmers meaning the militiamen, because they were just a group of farmers, "and fired the shot heard round the world." And that's a very famous line from Concord Hymn, the shot heard round the world. That refers to the shots that were first fired at Lexington and Concord, which began the War for Independence. So, fighting has begun. We have not yet declared our independence. The Declaration of Independence has not been written, it has not been signed, but we are already fighting with the British. So the Second Continental Congress and Civil War. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May of 1775. In June, just a month later, the British attacked the colonists at Breed's Hill and at Bunker Hill. The battle altogether became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. It really should have been named Breed's Hill, because that's where most of the fighting occurred, but it was just misnamed and they called it Bunker Hill instead. Anyway, after 3 attacks by the British, the colonists were overrun due to a lack of supplies. So it was a victory for the British, but it was a pretty devastating victory. They had over 1,000 casualties. So it became a moral victory for the colonists. Even though they lost, it was a moral victory for them. The only reason they were defeated was due to a lack of supplies. They showed that they could hold their own against the British. If they had not run out of supplies, they could have beat them. And that's important because, once again, they're not even an official military yet. They're still just a militia, the Minutemen. So after this battle, the Continental Congress created the Continental Army, the official colonial military. And they named George Washington as the lead general of the Continental Army. But despite the fighting, most delegates at the Congress still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. So, in July of 1775, just again a month after the attack at Breed's in Bunker Hill, Congress drafted something called the Olive Branch Petition. An olive branch is a symbol of peace, and a petition means you're asking for something. So the Olive Branch Petition was asking for peace, the colonists asking for peace with Britain. It was addressed directly to King George III. Not to Parliament. It was addressed to the king himself. They hoped that if they appealed directly to him and told him what was happening, that he would end this drama. And they pledged their loyalty to King George III. In this petition, they asked Britain to respect the liberties of the colonists by repealing the recent oppressive legislation and removing the British troops from the colonies. But King George III would not accept the petition, and he declared that the colonies were in a state of rebellion. And he sent 30,000 German mercenaries, or Hessians, to the colonies. Mercenaries are hired soldiers. So these are not necessarily people from the country that they're fighting for. And in this case, they were German. They were called the Hessians. And so, their heart is not really going to be in this war. And it becomes a British disadvantage because these soldiers, the Hessians, they were fighting for a paycheck. They're not personally invested in the outcome. So they don't care. They get paid either way. They win or lose, they get paid. Now remember that not all of the colonists were united. You had patriots and you had loyalists. And so there was conflict within the colonies themselves, not just a conflict with the colonists in Britain, but with the colonists themselves. And that became a disadvantage for the colonists. So patriot leaders called colonists to support the patriot cause, which at this point was now calling for independence. That was their cause. One example of this is Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. And you're going to read that later. This was given in March of 1775. And Patrick Henry gave this speech at a Virginia convention in order to gain support for a resolution for Virginia to arm itself against the British. So basically what I mean by that is Virginia was having this convention. They were trying to decide if they would arm themselves against the British or not. Patrick Henry delivers this speech in support of arming Virginia. Give me liberty or give me death. Another example is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was a scholar from England, and he wrote a pamphlet. Remember, that's how ideas were spread around the fastest at this time, was through pamphlets. And the pamphlet was called Common Sense. And in it, he called for American independence and attacked King George III. He said that colonies did not need Britain anymore, especially economically. They've established their own trade and their own economic system, their own market. They don't need Britain anymore. And he used a parent-child imagery. Basically, he's asking, what happens when children grow up? They take care of themselves, right? They move away from their parents' houses and they take care of themselves. And so he's saying it's only common sense that a colony would eventually grow up and could take care of itself, and it wouldn't need its mother country as much as it did before. So with ideas like this spreading around the colonies, eventually the idea of independence is presented to the Continental Congress. And it was presented by Richard Henry Lee. When they knew that they would be defeated, the Loyalists withdrew from Congress. After much argument and much debate, of course. Thomas Jefferson was then elected as the author of the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration, Jefferson blamed the rift between Britain and the colonies on King George III, not on Parliament. And that's really important, because blaming something on the king and accusing the king of things like this is treason. Thomas Jefferson also pulled from a lot of the ideas from the Enlightenment, especially the ideas of John Locke, and you'll see that as you read through the Declaration. So, the Declaration of Independence was approved on July 4th, 1776. And crowds celebrated once they heard the news. Crowds celebrated, and they destroyed effigies of King George III. And it just symbolizes this psychological break between the king and the colonies. They're breaking away from their patriarch. And so when we look at the Declaration of Independence, you'll be able to see all of these different ideas that Thomas Jefferson got from the Enlightenment and how he used them against King George in Parliament. So now independence has been officially declared, but that doesn't mean that Britain is just going to let the colonies go. They're not going to say, okay, you've declared your independence, that's it, we won't control you anymore. There's obviously going to be a fight. And so that's when the War for Independence begins.